Aurelian. It's great to be here. Let me start out with a little bit of history. The idea for this symposium came from the senior management or leadership of the ABA's antitrust section. If you know anything about the Antitrust Law Journal, we're a fiercely independent journal, and we don't like taking direction from the ABA section. But we thought about this, and we thought, a dynamic competition symposium is a really great idea. Sometimes we should take direction. So the idea mushroomed, and we've had a really tremendous response. We've had so many high-quality submissions that we're going to wind up having the symposium across 2 editions of ALJ, which is very unusual. Aurelian has then leveraged, as my clients like to say, the articles for the symposium into the basis for the terrific symposium we're going to have today. I want to first make some thanks. Obviously, Aurelian for organizing today and playing a really instrumental role in curating and soliciting articles for the symposium. Our executive editor, Robbie Robertson, managing editor, Nick Grimmer, and vice chair for economics, Liz Bailey, for all their work reviewing and making editorial suggestions on, what were probably 20 submissions of articles. Finally, ALJ symposium editors for this symposium, Adam DiVincenzo and David Meyer, for their really great input and direction and reviewing a lot of the contributions themselves. Before the presenters get into it, I thought it might be useful to align on a couple of basic, but I think really important propositions about dynamic competition. First of all, when we talk about dynamic competition, we could be talking about a lot of things. For example, we'll focus a lot on focus on innovation, not just static effects from competitive behavior. But very fundamentally, I think dynamic competition can be said to be almost synonymous with the project of antitrust in the first place. Most antitrust cases are forward-looking, so we are constantly dealing with anticipating changed market conditions when we try to predict the future, when we try to reach conclusions in antitrust cases. So I think dynamic competition is just inherent in just about all antitrust. The second point I would make is that while various schools of antitrust try to sometimes claim dynamic competition for themselves, dynamic competition is certainly not the exclusive province of any philosophy of antitrust, whether that be an interventionist philosophy or an anti-interventionist philosophy. Dynamic competition, I think, as we'll hear more about in the next session, can cut both ways. It can provide a defense, for example, for a merger or conduct that would be anti-competitive in a static market, but there may be an argument that new entry or other types of dynamic effects will eliminate any concerns. On the other hand, dynamic competition can give rise to competitive concerns that wouldn't arise in a purely static environment. There may be an argument that a merger will involve a dominant firm acquiring a likely entrant, or conduct by a dominant firm outside the merger context can quelch dynamic competition going forward. So clearly dynamic competition can be both a shield or a sword, to use a cliche. I wanted to talk a little bit about an aspect of dynamic competition that particularly interests me as a practitioner. The concept I wanted to briefly touch on is probabilistic inquiry. When we deal with antitrust problems, as I alluded to before, we are mostly making a probabilistic inquiry. Most of the time, when we have an antitrust problem, we're trying to reach a conclusion about what's likely to happen in a very uncertain future. It is then for the antitrust authority or the court to come to a conclusion about the likely but certainly uncertain effect of conduct that is being challenged or is at issue. We see this certainly in the vast majority of merger cases, except for perhaps some instances where we have an already consummated merger. In fact, the very language of Clayton Act Section 7 ask whether the effect of a deal may be to substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly. So you see the notion of dynamic competition in the statute itself. We also see a very high percentage of Section 1 and Section 2 cases involve predictions about the future, not just evaluation of past effects. So it has been said that the art of prediction is very hard, particularly when the prediction is about the future. I always thought that Yankee great Yogi Berra was the subject of that observation, like he observed, several dozen other profound statements. But it turned out in doing my research for this speech that there's an ongoing controversy about whether the originator of that observation was actually a very different man, whether it was Danish physics legend Niels Bohr who actually said that. So I think it's a little bit ironic that we're talking about predicting the future, and we can't even agree on who made a statement about the future, probably half a century ago. So I think the prospects for reaching consensus when we look at probabilistic inquiry and looking into the future, can be grim, but we'll certainly try. I also want to say that, even in the simplest cases, it can be difficult to predict the future. Let's say we have a merger of the first and fourth leading steel pipe manufacturers, and the question is whether prices will increase as a result of that merger over the next 3 or 4 years. That can be a very difficult inquiry, even in what would seemingly be the most static of industries, where we're not talking a lot about innovation or a lot of, fancy notions of dynamic competition. So when we introduce, really complex theories of dynamic competition, we're really multiplying the complexity of a probabilistic inquiry. Just a few examples. We sometimes will have to think about whether creative gales of destruction, as Schumpeter put it, will take care of any monopolistic conduct and discipline a monopolist. We have to think about whether the future weather is going to be conducive to those gales of destruction, or whether we need to intervene lest the monopolist have too easy a life and get fat and lazy. And that involves just a myriad of factual considerations and predictions about the future. We need to think about whether traditional tools of market definition and concentration levels are up to the task of, let's say, a merger involving a high-tech platform or an aggregation of platforms. Do we need to revolutionize our methods of inquiry for that kind of situation, or are more traditional methods up to the task? Again, that can be very fact-specific and have a lot to do with very, very multiplex determinations about the future. How do we account for network effects and scale economies in an uncertain future state? It seems like they will sometimes prove a nearly insuperable barrier to dynamic entry or expansions, but under certain conditions, they probably won't. How do we even know what facts we need to look at to determine which of those situations is more likely to be the right way of looking at a future competitive context? I would say relatedly, there's a really important question of who bears the risk when we're talking about, terrific uncertainty about outcomes. I would even posit that when we think about the interventionist schools and anti-interventionist schools of antitrust thinking, a lot of what really separates them is different views of who bears the burden of uncertainty. So I think that question is really critical when we try to sort through difficult antitrust questions. Another, important question is how we allocate those burdens when it comes to different types of cases. If we're dealing with a case involving notions of dynamic competition or other types of certainty, Do we have a different notion of burden when we're dealing with a monopolist who is accused or even has founded to be engaged in exclusionary conduct? In that situation, do we impose a high burden on the monopolist to prove that its conduct will not, in fact, make any difference, perhaps because of dynamic competition? I think the Microsoft case really implied that we would place a special burden on a monopolist guilty of exclusionary conduct in that sort of situation. If we're talking about the merger context, do we set different burdens depending on whether a merger defendant is arguing that what would be an anti-competitive merger in a static world will be benign because of dynamic competition factors? Do we put a heavy burden on that defendant and perhaps a lighter burden on a plaintiff arguing that conduct that might not be a problem in a more static world will be a problem because it removes a potential entrant or even a potential entrant that is simply affecting conduct based on the perceptions of the current monopolist or current oligopoly? Or do we place the burden the same whether dynamic competition is an argument being made by a defendant in a merger or another kind of case, or by the plaintiff in that case? So I think these questions require a lot of thought. Time's too short for me to suggest any answers here, even if I had any answers to these questions. But I would argue that when we think about really sophisticated theories of dynamic competition from a conceptual perspective, it's also really important to think about how we apply those conceptual theories in the real world of deciding cases in the face of great uncertainty and all kinds of arguments about how we should be predicting the future. So that's what I have to say. This promises to be a really great event. I really hope everyone learns a lot today, as I know we will, and that we have some fun doing it. Thanks very much.